We start the session on the book Paro Dreams of Passion, a satirical take on Free India's amateur attempt in the face of new freedom achieved. The critic for this book is Mr. Ravi Singh. He is one of the best editors in the field of publishing. After a long stint in Penguin India as the publishing head, he moved to set up LF Rupa. He has recently launched a new publishing house called The Speaking Tiger for writers from South Asia.
The author, Ms. Namita Gokhale, is writer and publisher. She has written 12 books, including several works of fiction. Her first novel, Paro, Dreams of Passion, which created a furor with its candid sexual humor, celebrates its 30th anniversary edition in 2014. Our novels include A Himalayan Love Story, The Book of Shadow, Shakuntala, The Play of the Memory, and Priya, a recent sequel of Paro. Ms. Gokhale has worked extensively with Indian myth. She has written the Book of Shiva and retold the Mahabharata for young readers. She also co-edited the landmark anthology In Search of Sita, Revisiting Mythology. One of the founders and co-director of Jaipur Literature Festival and of Mountain Echoes, the annual Bhutan Festival, she is committed to showcasing literature from across the Indian languages and currently curates Kitab Nama, Book and Beyond, a multilingual book show on Doordarshan. We first of all invite Mr. Ravi Singh to share his views on the book.
Yeah. I thought I won't say very much about the book apart from the very brief description, and you've also talked about it. It's best for you to get a sense of it through the reading, through the discussion. And the only thing I'll say is that I'm happy most, or maybe every school child who was here earlier, all the school children have left, because this is, we were a bit worried about how we were going to discuss the book, so much of it being about very frank sexual, the very frank sexual lives of the characters. So that is liberating. But essentially, it's been described as a social comedy without parallel in contemporary Indian writing, and that really is true. It was first published in 1984, and it's now, this is the 30th year, and there was a special 30th year edition that Penguin brought out. And in these 30 years, I at least haven't read any book published in these 30 years which even comes close in terms of the wit, the acid wit, the insight which is often, well, always merciless, often brutal, about the lives of the rich and the rapacious in India. And it is about a lot more than that, of course, which we'll discuss over the next hour or so. So I think I'll just leave you to get a sense of the book before we start talking through the reading. Is it going to be, who's reading? Okay, so over to you then.
So I'll be reading the passage which is right from the beginning of the book. I'm writing about them because I saw myself in her. I was BR's secretary at the time. All of us at the office thought he was a real dreamboat. He looked straight into our eyes. He knew all our first names. He was a compulsive nymphomaniac. The dictionary says that a male nymphomaniac is properly described as a victim of satyriasis. But I think that he was a nymphomaniac, and I think that it was related to his compulsive need to sell himself. He was short, but he hadn't begun to go bald. And he was our boss. Ivy, Mary, and I loved him madly, and all of us hated Paro. She would breeze into the office every now and then and appraise us through narrow, green, grey eyes. Her eyes mocked us, and they mocked our devotion to BR. BR had decorated the office himself. It was like the temple of Pallas Athene for us. The clear white lines of formica, the immaculate swivel chairs, the perfectly tended potted plants, as perfectly tended as the oyster pale nails of his personal secretary. It was only her bouffant that was a little ruffled, that and her expression when she emerged from the Sanctum Sanctorum after taking private dictation. BR's company manufactured the famous Sita sewing machines and associated household goods. The company's motto of "the housewife's friend" reverberated like an echo through its offices and corridors. In splendid Gothic lettering, it was accompanied by a gigantic color blow-up of our consumer, the housewife, as envisaged by BR and the whiz kids from the publicity department. The housewife was a blousy, voluptuous woman who bestowed come-hitherish looks on a resplendent sewing machine, while her husband stood timidly searching his pockets for his hanky in the middle foreground. I see him as he is now, and he is very different. His air, which to my besotted eyes had as much vitality in its every black root as in his every magical gesture or action, is now plastered vainly over his balding forehead. He is prematurely grey at 46, and the salt and pepper hair on his hirsute, softly undulating chest is always exposed all the way to the bulging belly button. The cool, calculated poise of his mannerisms seem unreal, as indeed it is, hiding, as it does, an almost phobic terror and insecurity. His voice, so musical then in its masculine timbre, sounds a little fruity now. He is, I must confess, a much diminished man. And I think of Paro as I saw her last, flushed with drink and anger. And I think of the sea at Marine Drive, the first time that he kissed me, vast, ugly, and compulsive. I yielded almost immediately to the pressure of his plastic lips, but a part of me held back, observant and detachedly clinical. I stared instead at the coy moon hiding behind the white clouds, and watched the restless ocean regurgitate its steaming refuse back onto the black sullen rocks. I remember the touch of his hands, and his suddenly gentle tongue, and the overpowering smell of his cologne, and the hardness between his legs, and the murmured words of love. My heart was pounding wildly, and I quite forgot there was a world outside. But a Nariyal Paniwala disturbed us, insistently holding out 2 obscene-looking coconuts. The evening papers were full of some mass murderer those days, and I could glimpse some madness and hatred in his obsessive staring eyes as he insisted that we buy one. Still, BR's hands continued tender, yet insistent in their proficient ministrations to my breasts, and eternity lay before us. For days I lay swooning in a lush romantic haze. My insides would bump against my heart every time I even thought of him. My life changed completely. I cannot really remember those days, except that every second was bathed in grace. Then, one Friday, I saw Anita, his private secretary. Her bouffant and her expression were both in a familiar state of disarray. A month later, he was married to Paro. It took all of us at the office completely by surprise. I have never forgotten, nor forgiven, a hurt. This book, too, is a vindication. My favorite author when I was 19 was Daphne du Maurier. My favorite novel was, of course, Rebecca. BR's flat lay like a jewel in the palm of Bombay, and in our dreams we often traipsed wraith-like through its gracious environs. The first time I went there was on a weekend when BR's father was out of town. I had never seen so much beauty before. I was spellbound by the opulence and the quietude, the azure carpeting, the dazzling white of the walls, the Ajanta fresco painted on the drawing room wall. All held me in incredulous thrall. I stopped to examine a convoluted sculpture in wood and metal that stood majestically in a corner. "What is that?" I asked curiously. "It's by Hardin," he said proudly. "He was heavily influenced by Henry Moore. Very phallic, you know." I looked up phallic in my dictionary that night and was shocked to discover what it meant, and that people could use the word so casually or indeed so display such sculptures in their drawing rooms. He led me like a princess into his bedroom. Gently, he poured me some wine in a stemmed glass. It was my first taste of alcohol. It tasted heady and strange, as did everything else in this incredible new world that was unfolding bravely about me. "Do you like classical Western compositions, love?" he asked me gravely. Mutely, I agreed that I did. He glided across to the built-in stereo system and pondered for a while over the records. "Stravinsky," he intoned dreamily, "The Rites of Spring." A strange beatification, a feeling of utter lassitude overtook me. I forgot that my nails were as chewed and bitten as a schoolgirl's pencils, and that my sandals had gaping mouths in them. I felt beautiful and beloved. Very gently he stroked my hair. He undid my plait and let it loose about my shoulders. His soft white hands caressed my neck. His fingers were long and slim. Perfect half moons rose mystically from each cuticle. I was mesmerized by his presence and the music. His hand slid softly down the front of my blouse and began stroking my breast. I pretended to be so lost in the music as not to have noticed. After some time, the hand withdrew. One eyebrow rose quizzically over his magical eyes. "Come with me to the balcony," he commanded. Marine Drive lay below us. His voice was as insistent and as insinuating as the rhythmic sea. It was high tide. "Priya," he breathed. The moonlight shone on a ghost-like jungle of cacti, crotons, bougainvillea, and all kinds of plants I did not recognize. The humid sea breeze was laden with floral night smells. A single pubic hair began itching beneath my blue nylon panties. The feeling spread. He led me back to the bedroom and took me there. Later, he read me some poetry which I did not understand. Thank you.
I have to say, you stole some of my thunder because I was going to start with this line, "A single pubic hair began itching beneath my blue nylon panties." And this is 1984. Even in 2014, you wouldn't find anybody writing so matter-of-factly and with any lack of the beauty of passion that you would associate with your certain descriptions like this. And that really is an element which is constant throughout the book and which I wanted to perhaps start the discussion with. Namita, is this sense of, well, no, let me put it this way. I mean, there is an investigation, a sense of corruption throughout the book, but nothing is beautiful in the book, which brings me to the other point, is that it is a deeply subversive book at many, many levels. That's what I felt. It subverts the traditional thing about the male gaze. You have the female gaze in this book. The men are objectified, though of course BR, who's the character you read something about, he does, I mean, he is invested with certain complexity, some human qualities, tenderness, etc. later. But it is Paro and Priya, the voyeur who's observing Paro and everybody else and writing about it. They really are the strong characters in the book. They observe everybody, they objectify the men, you know, and so on and so on. So it's subverting patriarchy, the male gaze. It's subverting this notion of love. Nobody loves anybody in this book. And it's also subverting, strangely for a book that is so frankly sexual, as I said throughout, this whole concept of the gloriousness of physical passion. There's nothing glorious about it. The whole concept of beauty and youth is also subverted. If you would have noticed when in the reading, the second chapter, BR is being described in physical terms as a man past his prime. He's balding, is he fat or whatever? He's balding. He's certainly not good looking. And so throughout the book, most of them are past their prime in terms of the physical appearance, or they never were really beautiful to begin with. Paro is this wonderful presence throughout the book, but she is flamboyant, almost obscenely flamboyant sometimes. She's completely compelling, but she's not beautiful. And so that set me thinking that you wrote this book was published when you were 26. You would have written it when you were 24, 25.
Can you hear me? So it was actually published when I think I was 27 and written when I was 26.
Okay, so at 26, this compelling cynicism, almost, I mean, there's nothing is sacred. The character and the universe, there are no illusions about anything. It is a merciless, even brutal book. How did you come in at 26? That astonishes me.
I think it startles me to think that young in age girl who wrote the book 35, 34 years ago, and that the book has survived and its voice has remained true. And I think I'd been through a lot at that time in terms of having been thrown out of college, run a film magazine. I'd had more experience than many people. And I was a mad observer. I mean, Priya was really my alter ego, though people thought I was Paro because I had brown-green eyes and Paro had grey-green eyes. And Paro used to drink gin and I used to drink a lot of cognac. So people thought she must be Paro. But the character I felt closest to was Priya because I used to compulsively watch people. And that's something become a bit lazier about now. But leave me in an airport or an airport lounge, so I devour other people's lives. And so, why I was so cynical, I can't say. I think I've become a little less cynical over the years. But I think it was the strength of youth. When you're young, you can be so sure, you can mock the old. When you're older, you don't mock the old. You can mock the weak. You can mock slightly older men. You can mock with much more certitude when you're young. So I think that is the strength of youth and the weakness.
You said no, as a voyeur, but surely there must have been people you liked that you observed also. You didn't put them in this book.
I think at that time, India I wrote it around in the early 80s. And I was reflecting back in the 70s, and I lived in a situation. I was living in Bombay, I was living in Delhi, I was publishing a film magazine, and I saw a lot of rather grotesque people. And I remember some Lavraj Kumar, he used to be a bureaucrat. He said, "Namita, do people like this really exist?" Because the drawing rooms were full of more polite people those days. I said, yeah, they do exist. And very soon, Page 3 came about, and the world, these people made their debut in the imagination of the public, but this was just before that. But also, I think I think I was a cynic, and I think I am a cynic. I just learned to shut up about it a bit more now.
So this was essentially, you were looking at the world in the late 60s, early 70s, around that time. And then there is, of course, who?
The timeline is to do with the construction of the Asian Games. For the Asian Games, there was some things going on. Color TV was just coming into India, and they were just getting into a new consumerist mode. And maybe the shadows of that were in these people who were old rich confronting the new rich world that was overtaking India.
Oh yeah, sorry. No. So yeah, see, that's the other thing that happens in the book, because as I said, it starts with a description of BR now, as in when she's writing, which would have been early 80s. Okay, but it starts from the time when she joined and fell in love with him, etc. So that would have been early, mid 70s, etc. So I forget now. Many people will know who said this, that the rich are, what is it? Yeah, not like us. Yeah, right? Yeah. Different. So, obviously at that time when you write about, for Priya at least was observing, they are different people. They're very, very different. And the book also is writing about the lives of the rich mainly, and the privileged. How different, and now because you wrote a sequel to this, Priya, which is also slightly about, well, not so much the rich, but the privileged, I suppose. How different are the rich now and then? Because there are a lot of similarities. The same. If you were to write this book today, how many of the episodes would stay?
I think I'm going to read out just a paragraph or two to all of you, which then you can draw your own conclusions whether things have changed in the last 30 or so years, or whether the lives of the rich are much as they used to be. So, because there's a strange deja vu and familiarity in this passage. So, Paro has now left her husband, BR, and she's in a sort of a relationship with somebody called Baki Bhanpur. So, she was living in open adulterous sin with Baki Bhanpur, test cricketer and heir to a princely family. The Baki, I gathered, was in commemoration of his faintly protruding front teeth, which lent a strange charm to his lean face. He was, like BR, what the boys in the office used to call a known Romeo. He was also a little younger than her. And then he's going with her, and they leave. So he didn't appear to be terribly enamored of her that night. In fact, when I bent down under the table to retrieve my handbag, I found amorous footplay in progress between him and the young and glamorous model who was sitting beside me. And then they left together soon after. We offered to drop Paro home. We is her and Priya and her husband Suresh. And as we steered uncertainly through the steaming heat of the summer night, we found that Baki Bhanpur and his model had crashed their long, flashy yellow sports car into a family of 3 who were crossing the road near the bus stop on Zakir Hussain Marg. They were villagers from Gurgaon, a farmer and his wife and their young son. Luckily, no one seemed to be hurt. They were all safe. Bhanpur and the model and the pedestrians. But the mandatory crowd had gathered. His Highness seemed quite fazed by the alcohol and the heat, and the young model was shrinking into herself at the collective comments of the crowd, who seemed more obsessed, lewdly and vocally, with her tiny halter top than by the fate of the terrified peasant family. The mood of the Janta was turning ugly. Paro showed her true metal then. She got out of the car, into the thick of the crowd, and looked things over. When she realized there was nothing much the matter, she clapped her hands, Mem Sahib fashion. Jao, jao, she said peremptorily. Ab tamasha khatam. Then she extracted 500 rupee notes from her purse. 500 rupee notes, not 500 rupee notes. And those days, 500 rupee notes was a lot of money. Then she extracted 500 rupee notes from her purse and handed them to the woman, whose wailing and accusations immediately stopped. Jao, she said to the crowd once again, and miraculously they dispersed. Get into the back seat, she snapped at the model. The terrified creature did as she was told. Paro got into the driver's seat, and without so much as a bye-bye to us, they whizzed off into the dark night. As my husband fumbled with the ignition keys, something between a leer and a salute shone in his eyes. What a woman, he said in sincere admiration. So Paro was this larger-than-life character, but this could happen in Delhi or indeed in Chandigarh without any surprises even now. The only difference is there were no air-conditioned cars, very few of them. So Suresh and his wife Priya did feel a bit hot. So it's just the power parity of money and the consumer. But the lives of the privileged never change in India. They just get better and better.
Also, this scene brings me to the other point, which I'd actually made a note to look at it. It's you don't spare the rich, obviously. You don't spare the beautiful. You don't spare the young. You don't spare the old. You don't even spare the poor. 500 rupees, khush ho ke khatam and all. So which again brings me back to the point. So it is an angry book, a merciless book. But what were you so angry about? I mean, you actually don't see any. Nothing much redeeming in any of these characters, any classes. You mark the socialist, the capitalist, everybody.
Well, I think when you're young, what are called your bullshit detectors are even stronger than as you grow older. I just saw a lot of ridiculous people walking around me, thinking a huge amount about themselves. And I just found them so funny and silly that I wrote about a book describing them as being funny and silly. And that was it, I think.
Well, it's not just funny, it's a dark book too. I found it dark. The humor is brutal, yes, but also, I don't know, I thought it was dark. Don't you think it was dark? It is dark.
It is dark. It was dark. Somebody asked me the other day, all your books end with somebody dying and some visit to the Shamshan, to the cremation grounds, and this one indeed began after I had been for the first time to the cremation grounds. And I was quite, there was somebody who read it then, and there was this big debate going on that, oh, Namita has written a pornographic book. And he said, you don't get it. It's not. It's more like this is a very big thing to say, but he said it's more like the Hindu term, neti, not this, not this. She's looking at everything with an equal amount of disgust. But I think in hindsight, I don't want to say what the book is about, because I just wrote a book that I observed around me, and it came out in that mad fury of a first novel, and it sustained herself. And now any comments I might, I meant this, I meant that, they sound a bit spurious. So I don't want to attach any great meaning. I was young. I was privileged enough to see a lot of things, to have experiences, to watch people with intensity, to be bored, amused, whatever. I actually, the guy who was BR, I met somebody who was just like BR, and I said, this is the man. And I did something which only a young person could do. I had dinner with him 3 or 4 times and told him I was writing a novel, and I took notes. And then, when the book came out, he called me. He said, Namita, this is a really good book, and I respect that it's a really good book. He called me out, and I went for dinner with him. He was quite what is called a known Romeo. So when I went out for dinner with him late at night to talk about the book, people were saying, what is she doing here? She's a married woman. Why is she having dinner with him? But he'd called me to say he would never speak to me again. He said that I like the book. It's a wonderful book. But my wife is so hurt. And his wife was also a bit like, his then wife was a bit like one of the characters in the book. He said, I promised her I will never meet you again, but I think you're a very good writer and it's a very good book. So it was very cruel of me, when you're young, And I have a nephew called Atul. And years later, 20 years later, he told me, Mommy, that character called Atul in your book, I've always thought he is a bit like me. And I felt so bad because it was a bit like him. So when you're young, you're not very considerate. Maybe that showed through in the book. And others' pain, you're not so sensitive to other people's pains and vulnerabilities. That's a mark of youth. I'm just trying to understand in hindsight why I wrote such a brutal book.
No, because some of what populates this book in terms of the emotions, at least, or the ideas, those have continued, in a sense, in different settings, I feel, through all your books since then. For instance, there's one thing, and this is everybody talks about how witty this book is. And how brutal, witty, funny, and this is Swiftian kind of satire. It's brilliant social satire. But yes, you're mocking, a lot of people in many situations. But there's also, for instance, the family. You're not being funny there. Nobody loves any. The mother doesn't love the daughter doesn't love the mother, the sister doesn't love the brother, husband and wife, of course, don't love each other. So that is not, you weren't mocking anybody. That isn't, people you were disgusted by. That is something more fundamental, which has stayed through the other novels as well.
Well, as all of you here probably know, the Indian family and the Indian joint family is also a very, very brutal organization. I mean, there is nothing more cruel than the joint family. And at the same time, it's essential to so many survivals. In a country where there is no social security, that family, that's where the old widow survives, that's where the young orphan child survives, but they survive in absolute tyrannies which are prescribed. And here there's an old mother, and I think Priya's hatred of her old mother is transferred because the mother is completely in love with the son, who is this slightly idiotic child called Atul, Atul Bhaiya. So I think I saw that a lot of young women around me, especially in those days, were having a rough time in their families. Because young girls were even less respected then than they are now within their situations. But this is all talk in hindsight. But yes, the cruelty of the family is a well disguised cruelty, but it's there. And it's still a safety net at the same time. And that's why people hang together, they don't leave it.
Yeah, no, that answers the other question I was going to ask, that they do make an effort despite all this. They still make an effort to remain within those institutions, family, marriage. Priya and Suresh, Priya makes a great effort to be the good housewife, good wife. But obviously, and then she's in love with BR. And each time she feels this great passion for her husband, even it's BR that she's fantasizing about, and then goes and seeks him out. So anyway,
but the family holds it together, because in the end, towards the end, when her husband throws her out, it's her bhaiya and bhabhi who take her back. So these are some of the realities of urban India, or anywhere in India. And I think that was...
So can we talk about you know, lack of a better phrase, what I'd call the female gaze over sexuality. As I said, a very sexual book, but it's very different. You know, around that time, Shashti Brata was writing around that time, and he also did, you know, Confessions of an Indian Woman Eater and other such stuff. That, you know, there was, I read it some years later, but even at that time, one was young and one said, my God, he's written this, and, you know, there was a thrill of, I won't say identification, you know, you were thrilled and you were shocked and there was a guilty pleasure and you read it, you understood. But this is completely, at least there's something very different about the manner in which sex is written about. There's the sexuality here. It's completely, I mean, I hadn't read anything like this
I think it's completely matter of fact. And it's where the sexuality is at the same level as other physical things like hunger and I think there's an intellectual explanation and a practical explanation for this. So would you like the practical explanation first or the intellectual
Both.
one? Okay, so actually, and a funny story beyond that is that the number of young men who read it and young women and felt a sense of liberation reading the book. I mean, I keep going to places where I meet people who tell me, you know, Namita, I was this age when I read the book. My parents had told me never to read it. It was on the bookshelf and I used to steal it and I put it under a brown paper cover. The other day I met Siddharth Vardarajan at a formal kind of a dinner. And he said, Namita, you know, this was the first book that I read that shook me up. And page 7, there was this sentence, a single pubic hair, and I couldn't believe it. And he still remembered the page number, having read it some 25 years ago. And there was a person called Hoshang Merchant who said that, you know, as a young homosexual, he for the first time got some sustenance, thinking people can be matter of fact about physical matters. And so that's one part of it. All these stories over the years that I've got from young men and young women, and they all felt sort of freed that, okay, we can talk about it, you know. But I'm grown up in the Kumaon Hills, and I'm a Pahari. And Paharis are extremely, it's not a very matriarchal society. And I grew up wild in the sense I was pretty much left to grow up by myself, reading what I wanted, meeting who I wanted. Nobody tried to tell me, do this, do that. Nobody ever tried to make me into an obedient daughter. In fact, I used to throw tantrums once in a while and my family would obediently say to me, I mean, my grandfather would tell everybody, isko devil aa gaya hai. Means she's been possessed by the devil. And so I was a wild sort of, not wild in a sense of being sort of going out much or having boyfriends, wild meaning being able to do, I was a wild sort of child. And so I didn't know that there were these boundaries, you weren't supposed to write this and all that. So when I was writing the book, my father saw the manuscript and he was an old-fashioned gentleman. And he said, Namita, you're writing a book? I said, yes. He said, what's it called? So I said, it's called Paro, Dreams of Passion. So he says, Dreams of Passion? I hope you've been discreet, child. So I said, I didn't say anything to him, but of course he should have realized I don't do discreet very well, you know, it's not my best quality. So it's the way I grew up, I didn't realize it would shock anybody. And once I realized it might shock somebody, I did a very cunning thing. I dedicated it to my mother-in-law. You know, because then it struck me when I was going to press, I said, my God, if so many people are getting so shocked by this, because I didn't imagine anybody would get shocked by it. So I said, to Ai. And then when the book came out, she and I had our quarrels and I was very fond of her. So I gave her the book. I said, Ai, it's dedicated to you. And Marathi liberal families can be Marathi liberal families. So then my whole family stood together. Nobody ever gave me any flack for the book. Though my poor husband, if I went out for dinner, he would get those kind of looks, you know. But it was wonderful to be in a family that gave me this total support. So, but it was a bit of a strategy also.
No, also, do you feel, at least on the basis of this book and the others I read, that women, now this again is a generalization and correct me, but they write differently when they're writing, when but sex scenes are about sexuality.
Indeed, that was the intellectual one I was going to tell you, which I forgot. Which is, but I think this is really true because when I think about how women write about sexuality, it is completely different from how men write about sexuality. This struck me when I read actually Tarun Tejpal's book, The Alchemy of Desire, which was also set in the mountains, rather like a book I had done, The Book of Shadows. And I realized that often when men write about sexuality, they write about sensuality and the joys and the pleasures of conquest and the supposed joy of the recipient of the sensuality. Whereas when women write about sensuality, they don't actually write about sensuality or sexuality. They write about their bodies. It's an act of reclaiming their bodies. Because in a society where your body, first of all, belongs to your father, your husband, your brother, your social community, and then you cannot ever become a writer unless you reclaim your body, because you can't reclaim your mind until you've reclaimed your body. So that's why it's a matter-of-fact way of saying, this is my body and I will describe it in as matter of fact. And that's what I tried to be in this book. I never yielded to sensuality, to romanticizing, or to anything. It was absolutely a matter-of-fact way of saying, this is my body, this is how it works, these are our bodies, this is how they work, and this is how I'll describe them. So it's an act of assertion and reclamation of the body, which the mind cannot do without. And that's why writers like Pushpa Maitri and in Hindi literature and all the other Indian regional literatures, every time a woman writes about her body, she meets shock and censure from the patriarchal, the word patriarchal itself, from some of the people around, and they don't get it. That she's just trying to say, this is me, and hey, I'm allowed to write about myself, and others like me.
And so was that also the reason why, let me just read 2 lines from here. This is the central presence.
You will never have to buy and read this book, because between Ravi and me, we'll have read out most of it to you.
So, okay, so, this is about the central presence in the book. Paro, who's this almost like an exotic bird. And Priya's observing her. This is a Paro who is but recently liberated from marriage and convention. She's still convinced that she's as young and desirable as she ever was. Her massive breasts, like the enlarged pores of her skin, have grown ponderous with age. Even her fingers have become fatter. But this coarsening of the body has also somehow catalyzed a startling vitality of mind, a vigor that is as crude as it is real. This is the beauty.
I wish it would happen to me. It's not.
This is one of the rare attempts, at least, at description of physical beauty. So was this also a deliberate thing, about women, and you're going to write about beauty, but this is what's making her compelling, which is hardly conventionally beautiful.
I'm not a great fan of feminine beauty or masculine beauty or anything, because when I see people, I tend to see energy bodies or the energy levels or the vitality levels, and so much of what is aesthetically beautiful is actually just nothing much. So, and aesthetics is so what I admired in the book, in Paro, was this indomitable spirit that she had. And it was crass, it was pushy, she was an awful woman, she was an unlikable woman, but she remained. And the fact that Paro, it says Paro is a magnificent creation, is what the London magazine said. And Paro survived. It's not my novel that survived, it's the character of Paro that survived. And she just stood for exactly that, for survival. And all the people around her are also trying to survive, and it's whether it's Priya or whatever, in a society that is not the kindest in the world.
Just briefly, an obvious question, but some of the characters reminded me of, maybe just because looking back now you make associations, like for instance Shambhunath Mishra, and that's the most compelling relationship in the entire book. Shambhunath Mishra, who is this grotesque, really grotesque man who is somewhat collecting funds for the Congress or whatever. He's a big shot in the Congress party. him and Paro, and there's no reason why she would be completely under his spell, but she is. And it's not a, it's a grotesque relationship in itself, and a compelling one. Anyway, so he reminded me, I forget his name now, of Congress wala fun collector, Naam hi bhul gaya uska. So, but clearly there were people who inspired characters in this book.
That man, there's a congressman called Shambhunath Mishra here, and I think there was at that time a congressman, very powerful congressman, who was rather like that. And all I know is that he recognized himself in it, because somebody else told me, and he was not a very good-looking man, and rather
That's
like
an understatement.
and somebody later told me this incredible story that they came across him in the Oberoi beauty parlor, where he was having a facial. And he was sitting there. I wish I could write a novel about it. There is this man whose name we will not mention. Let us say he was the fund collector of the Congress party in those days. He was thin, he wore a sari, a dhoti, maybe on a sari at night, who knows. And he was sitting in this beauty parlor, I was told, for men, having a facial. So his face was covered up. He had some cotton wool or some cucumber over his eyes. And he was talking to somebody, and that guy was saying, "Ye Namita Gokhale hai. इन्होंने किताब लिखी है. लोग कह रहे आपके बारे में है." And I don't know what, but this is what I was told, and yeah, well, it didn't. That's all I know.
Baki Bhandpur and
Oh, Baki Bhandpur was actually modeled on a particular. Everybody was a combination of 3 or 4 people, you know. And Paro herself had a bit of Rukhsana Sultan in her. And there was another person there who was rather like Paro, who for years afterwards, she died sadly, and she used to go out for dinner parties, dining out, she'd say, "I am Paro." And she loved it. But Baki Bhandpur was, I just been for a dinner party where VC Shukla was there. And he was a very good-looking man in his way with slightly buck teeth. So then that night, the Baki Bhandpur chapter came out. So I was observing people around me, but mixing them together without the tact and care which I would take if I was doing it now that I'm older.
And now that I'm older and looking back at the book, how do you react to people who still say that it is perhaps the first sari ripper, which fine, I can see why people would say that, but actually it's anything but that. I mean, it's completely, but is that something that bothers you, or do you like the fact that it is thought of as some kind of a precursor to, a trend? And none of them wrote as successfully or as sophisticated in any case, but we'll leave that aside. But is that something that you even react to at all?
You know, when the book came out, I'd done English literature. I was a literature student. I used to top in university. Then I had gone down in life and begun a film magazine after I was chucked out of college. And after that, I wrote a book, and people said, I mean, they just couldn't get it as, And I was a bit hurt by some of the reviews. Keki Daruwala was the only person who wrote a good review of the book. And internationally, in the literary establishment at that time, it got a lot of appreciation. And people like the Times Literary Supplement could get the nuances of there was a whole article about the different accents in the book, and where I wasn't explained when Paro says jao, I don't have to explain that go, she said, or whatever. So I wasn't explaining anything to anybody. And it was a natural book from where it came. And they had these whole articles about the Ox-Bias accented English of BR and the different, the Mumbai English of her mother. But the Indian press was very, very, very cruel to me, I must say. And my older daughter Meru told me about how once in class, her teacher had told her, your mother writes dirty books, and she said, no, she doesn't. I don't know. And so as a result, I wrote the most depressing book in the world to show that I was a true intellectual. So I wrote the book, the Himalayan Love Story. And nobody wanted to publish it, because I had created a style for myself and they expected me to go on writing like that. And that was defensiveness, I think, to write an ultra sad, depressing, melancholy book, which nobody...
It's perhaps my favorite book of yours.
The Himalayan Love Story, yeah. So then that's what happened. I reacted.
It was very. In fact, that was talking about what remains constant through your books, and that has this phrase that I've never forgotten, where the protagonist, one of the protagonists, he's come back to Nainital, and there's this woman whom he loved, and she's losing her mind. Anyway, so what happens, and then he's sad, etc. And one evening, there's this roadside stall owner. She's Tibetan, whatever, and he's attracted for no particular reason, and then they go and they have hurried sex. And after that, it says, and everything's over and he hears the world and he's depressed and all. He says, the body is truly an abomination. And the body being an abomination anyways, this book, whatever. So anyway, I like that book, not just for that one sentence, but many other things in it. What time is it? How much time should we take questions?
Yeah, very good in a while, but you could continue.
How long do we have?
We've got 15 minutes.
Okay, so
you
we
can
might as well.
complete your sentence.
Yeah. My sentence was just
Mr.
one.
Editor.
The other thing, a critic I've been called today, that was interesting. Just one thing about the party scene, which hadn't occurred to me, but when we were talking about this, and there's a very startling thing that you said, which is true. The party scenes, there are these glorious party scenes, excess, etc., in Paro. So that is 20th century, Lives of the Rich and the Bizarre, etc. And then there's another book that, a wonderful book called Shakuntala, which is set in ancient India. And then you said, well, the party scene in Shakuntala is almost the same as the party scene in Paro. That's astonishing.
Yeah, that was on the other bank of Banaras, where some Greek adventurers were having a nice old time. But yeah, I've written about 12 books, and I think there are 6 books of fiction or something, 7. And as you grow older, as I grow older, I can see certain themes. Otherwise, critics would say it's very difficult to categorize you because each book is different from the other. Now we can see certain themes, and one of them is this distrust of the body. And as I'm growing older, surely the distrust of the body, there's more and more reason for it than when you're younger. But yeah, and excess has always interested me. And it's bored me also. So there is always that. Khushwant Singh is the one who said that she writes about love, lust, and death. But death is also a subject that's always been very close to me. And Paro itself ends, as I said, in the cremation ground. And it began with my first ever visit to the cremation ground. And it stayed with me in the end. It was just about the funeral pyre. But yeah, let's say I'm a mean old woman and I was a mean young woman. So let's...
Okay, questions, anyone?
With the mic, there's one there, one there, one there. 3 questions, so we'll take them in whichever order you like.
Hi, Namita. I'm going to ask you a question. Part of it has already come up in your talk, but I was wondering if you would write a similar book now, how different would it be? And related to that, what are you working on now? So what can we look forward to?
Some years ago, on a strange impulse, I decided to do a sequel to Paro. And that was really a challenge, to see if I could get the same voice again. And it was written in Priya's voice. And all my friends said, Namita, don't sort of soften out now. Don't, suddenly become a discreet old lady. And I wrote about old age, sexuality, menopause, again about the body and the aging bodies and the younger bodies of these people. But I found that the vigor of that earlier style was not there. And what I find I've got worse at over the years is dialogue. Because when I try to write young people's dialogues, I just can't get it. Maybe when they talk to me in a more aunty way, and I'm not sitting and overhearing enough young people. So the dialogue has suffered. And so I know I cannot write a contemporary novel. I realized that with Priya, was because I just so didn't be able to get the rhythms and the ways in which people talk, especially young people. Then the other thing, I'm working on a novel that I wrote about 10 years ago, and it's been sitting around in different incarnations. It's just not getting out of my inbox or whatever. And it's almost through. And it's called Things to Leave Behind. And yeah, it's time to leave it behind, and then I'll know what I'll do next. But I don't want to talk about it till this book is out somewhere or the other.
My question is actually to you, Ravi. 3 decades ago, could you give us an insight into the kind of discussions that must have gone on in the publishing house before they accepted a book like Paro?
I'd have to imagine it. I'm old, but not that old. So 3
Yeah,
decades
I know
ago,
that.
was not in publishing.
You must
Pretty. The discussions would perhaps not be very different in some fundamentals than what would happen now. People are very easily shocked even now, and editors, publishers are the same as other people. Either that, or the other thing is they're too easily impressed by anything that intends to shock. That's the other problem. So some indifferent stuff, self-indulgent stuff would get published because it's shocking or it's fashionable, and fashionable not only in terms of the accepted fashions, but fashionable in terms of how it subverts accepted fashions. That happens a lot these days. Anything that is unusual or different or can be talked up as subversive gets published. A lot of it shouldn't get published. Though actually that's wrong. I think anything, as long as it's not hate literature, should get published. Why not? So the discussions wouldn't be very different. They'd say, like single pubic hair, and there's what a clenched index finger is doing, and the woman's doing to herself with that. People would worry, obscenity, etc., etc. Perhaps more in these times than maybe even last year. So the discussions would be pretty much the same. But all a book really needs is somebody who connects with it at a very intense level as a reader, as an editor. Which isn't the same as saying this is brilliant writing. Of course, that is or should be the prerequisite, but something more than that. So if that editor exists, doesn't matter when a manuscript comes in, So made it more complicated than I meant it to. Sorry. There was a question here. Yeah.
Take the mic.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I read Paro last night. Somebody recommended to me, and I started reading at 1. I slept at 3:30 because I wanted to be have read it and then attend the session. I couldn't put it down. And also, at no point, except for probably the dresses of the women, I could not feel it was written 30 years ago. I related to it, I think, at almost every fundamental level. So, and especially being in Chandigarh, I think it replicates the society that was then in Bombay, now in Chandigarh. So that is that. So it's a great book, so yeah, that is there. But my question to you said that probably if you would write it now, or maybe even a few years back, you would probably not be as brutal in characterization as you were then. Probably, maybe round it off the edges and stuff. But I think if you would have done that, probably I wouldn't have liked it. I mean, the characterization, because it is so brutal, comes across as so real. So don't you think that if you would have liked to tone it down or probably mask it behind something else, it wouldn't have stood out as it is standing out now? Or probably people would have not been able to relate it in such a way that they have been able to relate it, had you played down the characters a little.
Yeah, the thing is that it's very difficult to write it now or then. But books have their own expiry dates. And the expiry date of social comedy is usually quite soon, because as society changes, social comedy loses its jokes and its flavors. Like the book I've written after this, Priya, which is a sequel, I think it'll date much faster for various reasons. But that's why it's easier if you go back 100 years to relate to a book. 30 years is just too uncomfortably close. But I think because the characters were so much themselves, not only a product of their times, and although they were a product of a very, very particular society, but they stood out beyond that. That even in a very small town, there's always a local Paro. So I think that the grand characters, they survive. And otherwise, as they said, you cannot step into the same waters twice. And so, what if? But I'm glad you like the book.
Namita, you said that the reviews in India were not very good. Do you think the reviews would have been better if you had written under a masculine name?
It's very likely, except that nobody would have thought of a man who would. It was so much a woman's view as that I don't think it would have helped at all. You've got to remember, those were the days of the people who were writing were Anita Desai, who also wrote a very nasty review, by the way, as I remember it, and Kamala Markande. So they wrote very prettified, gentrified, people like us books. I don't think it would have survived with a masculine name. I think Ravi has something to say to this.
Something wonderful that I forgot to read that gives me an excuse to. So, I don't know if a man, or a reader, if they thought this was written by a man, would be convinced by this, that a man has written this. So, Priya has been writing towards the end of the book. It's discovered that she's been making notes, that, she's a voyeur, she's been watching everybody writing about them. And many people are outraged. So now she's with BR, her original boss and lover. He's found out about it and he's asking her, so what are these things about, these things that you've written? So she says, passion, boredom, vanity, and jealousy. I said, finally feeling a little pompous enunciating such long words. So he says, come love, tell me what it's really about, he said. Liberation, I hazarded. That provoked him, and now this is BR speaking. Women's liberation, he exclaimed. My author friend, can you in your book liberate me from the onerous responsibility of making love to every attractive or unattractive woman who uses me like a dildo to make her husband jealous? Can you liberate me from the financial burdens of alimony? Can you free me from the jealous possessiveness of the one woman I love? Can you bring up my children for me? He was agitated and a little out of breath. So I don't think a man would have been able to make another man say this.
Yeah, in fact, a few years ago, I met a gentleman at a dinner party, and then he bought a copy of Paro. And he rang me up, he's an American man, and he said, wow, I've never read a book that hits out at men like that. And so I don't think it would have been convincing. And he would have, the anonymous, the male character would have, the pseudonym would have got even more flack. I think it was just that I was seen as a middle-class Indian woman. I used to wear saris mostly. I was from a discreet and well-brought-up family. So they just didn't, if I had had some name like, if I just had a different persona. Because very soon after that, Shobhadi began writing. And Shobhadi never shocked anybody in the same way. And she built up a whole thing. And in fact, when the second edition of Paro came out, somebody wrote a review, Preeta wrote a review in Sunday, saying, who is this writer? Why is she trying to copy Shobha Dey? And then Veer Sanghvi gave her a bit of flack for that. So it was just an accident. I'd say it was an enduring accident, Paro. Lovely name.
Thank you for this very interesting session, Ms. Namita Gokhale and Mr. Ravi Singh. We now invite Mr. Mitul Dixit to kindly hand over the token of appreciation to Ms. Gokhale and Mr. Singh.